All right, before we jump into today's episode, just a quick heads up. This episode deals with mental health, suicide, and media misinformation. No graphic details, but it is heavy. So if today's not the day, totally cool. You have to take care of yourself always. So let's hit that theme song. Hey, and welcome back to another Mainline Monday edition of the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe, professional nostalgia archaeologist, and the guy who asks, okay, but why did everyone freak out about this? And this is a new thing I'm trying. I'm calling it the Nerd Crime Files. And the whole idea here is looking at moments where something bad happened. And instead of dealing with the actual problem, society as a whole went, yeah, but what if it was the nerd shit? And if that sounds familiar, that's kind of the point. We briefly touched on this same kind of thing back in the 90s Anxiety Panics episode. And for episode 1, we kind of have to start at the beginning. Because this is where America learned to be afraid of imagination. So right at the top, let me introduce you to James Dallas Egbert III. And right away, I want to kill a misconception. James was not some grown dude living in a basement playing pretend. He was just 16, barely old enough to drive, still a kid, and somehow already enrolled at Michigan State University. Which, look, I don't care how smart you are, 16-year-olds should not be trusted with dorm life and adult expectations. I don't care if you are a genius. That's just bad planning. So James was a prodigy, like genuinely gifted. He skipped grades, crazy smart, the kind of kid adults look at and go, oh wow, this one's going to be just fine. And it's that thought right there. That's usually where things start going wrong. Because when a kid is labeled gifted, what adults often hear is finished. Like, congratulations, you solved childhood. No further support required. But the thing is, being smart doesn't mean you're emotionally equipped. It doesn't mean you know how to make friends. And it definitely doesn't mean you're ready to carry the weight of expectations from everyone around you. So James is 16, living on a college campus, surrounded by adults, trying to keep up academically, socially, the whole thing. And he is struggling, quietly. Which again, very important context here. This is the late 1970s. Mental health is not something people are openly talking about just yet. There is no language for it, no real safety net, no, hey, I'm not okay kind of culture, especially if you're the smart kid. Because if you're struggling and you're gifted, people don't ask how you're doing. They just assume you're going to figure it out. James did not snap. He didn't spiral publicly. He didn't cause problems. He just felt isolated, depressed, overwhelmed. And like a lot of kids who feel that way, he gravitated towards imagination, science fiction, fantasy, games. And yeah, this is where Dungeons & Dragons enters the picture. But not in a spooky way, just a normal way. D&D wasn't about losing touch with reality. It was about structure, story, control, sitting at a table with other people and agreeing on rules, which, honestly, when your life feels completely chaotic, that's comforting as hell. You roll dice because at least the dice make sense to you. And then, in August of 1979, James disappears. Just poof, gone. No dramatic note, no fantasy quest, just a missing 16-year-old kid in crisis. And this is the moment where everything could have gone one of two ways. We could have asked, how do we help? What support did he need? What did we miss? But instead, America as a whole asked, What was he playing? And that's where this story goes off the rails. And before we keep going, I need to zoom out for just a second, because this story does not hit the same way without understanding the moment it happened in. 1979. And America is already on edge. Vietnam is still fresh. There's this deep mistrust of institutions. Parents are freaked out about their kids becoming different than them. And there's a growing sense that culture is slipping out of adult control. The music's changing. Kids are dressing differently. Religion is getting louder. TV is in everyone's house now. And a lot of adults are looking around going, I don't recognize this world anymore. And that matters. Because moral panics don't come out of nowhere. They show up when fear is already in the room and just needs a target. And in the late 70s, people were primed and ready, especially to be scared of youth culture, especially to be scared of anything that looked secretive, symbolic, or hard to explain. Which is why something like Dungeons and Dragons was basically catnip for moral panic. Think about it from the outside. It's kids sitting around a table using strange words, rolling dice, talking about demons, spells, and dungeons. No adults involved. No obvious rules that you can see. And no scoreboard. If you already think the world is drifting away from you, that looks suspicious as hell. And this is also right at the beginning of the rise of televangelism. Loud voices on TV telling parents, your kids are under attack. There are forces corrupting them. You need to be vigilant. So when James disappears, the culture is already asking all the wrong questions. Not, what happened to this kid? But, what does this all mean? And that, my friends, is dangerous. Because when people start looking for meaning instead of the facts, they will absolutely connect dots that were never meant to touch. So when someone goes, well, he played this fantasy game, that doesn't land in a neutral environment. That lands in a country already scared of imagination, rebellion, and kids having inner lives adults don't control. And once you see it that way, the panic makes horrible sense. Not justified, but predictable. And that's what makes this story so frustrating. Because James didn't just disappear into a vacuum. He disappeared into a moment that was desperate for a villain. So now that we've talked about why adults were already on edge, let's talk about the thing they decided was the villain. Nowadays, when people hear Dungeons and Dragons, they think of Stranger Things, Critical Role, or your friend Dave doing a very bad accent for 3 hours straight. That is not what D&D was in 1979. Back then, this thing was brand new, super niche, barely understood. This wasn't a mainstream hobby yet. This wasn't Target shelves and starter kits. This was weird little booklets with dense text, hand-drawn art, and terminology that sounded straight up ominous if you didn't know what you were looking at. You've got words like Dungeon Master, spells, alignment, demons. If you're already suspicious of culture, that is not helping. And visually, I mean, come on, let's be honest. Early D&D art did it absolutely no favors. A lot of it looked dark, medieval, occult adjacent if you squinted hard enough, which is kind of hilarious because the reality was just a bunch of socially awkward kids sitting around a table arguing about rules and initiative. But from the outside, it kind of looks secretive. And adults hate secretive kid shit. Because here's the thing, D&D required the imagination, not passive consumption. You weren't just watching something, you weren't just listening to music. You were actively creating stories, making choices, living in your head for just a few hours. And to adults in the late 70s, that was completely terrifying, because it meant the kids had inner lives that weren't being supervised. No parental rating, no clear messaging, no authority figure telling you what it meant. Just kids making stuff up. And if you don't understand imagination, you tend to assume it's dangerous. So when news stories start throwing around phrases like fantasy role playing, adults hear loss of touch with reality, escapism, delusion, not storytelling with math. And that misunderstanding is crucial because no one stopped to explain what the game actually was. No one went on TV and said, hey, this is collaborative storytelling. Instead, they just let the scariest interpretation win. And once you let fear define something first, it's almost impossible to claw it back. That's why when James disappears, Dungeons and Dragons is not treated like a hobby anymore. It's treated like a suspect. Like, oh, so that's what he was into. And that's all it takes. Because suddenly the game isn't neutral. It's evidence. Which is insane because millions of kids were playing D&D without disappearing into tunnels. But fear doesn't care about scale. Fear cares about vibes. And D&D had weird vibes to adults who did not understand it. So the moment the press needed a narrative, this one was already ready-made. A game no one understood. A kid who vanished. A culture already on edge. Perfect storm. So, at this point, James is missing. And this is important. Everyone is scared, but nothing is supernatural just yet. The family's scared. The university's scared. The police are like, okay, missing person, let's figure this out. This should have been a straightforward, tragic situation. But then, someone gets an idea. And not a very good one. Enter William Deere. And I want to be careful here because this is not a cartoon villain story. William Deere was not twirling a villain's mustache, he was just a private investigator brought in to help find a missing kid. And that part matters. But here's where things kinda go a little sideways. Deere learns that James played Dungeons and Dragons, and instead of going, okay, that's just a kid's hobby, he goes, and that, that one little curious eyebrow raise is basically the spark that lights the entire forest on fire. Because Deere starts floating a theory, not a conclusion, not evidence, just a theory that maybe James had gotten so deep into a fantasy role-playing game that he was acting it out in real life. And to be fair, Deere himself later said that the media took his theory and ran way past anything he actually meant. Now, pause. I need you to understand how fast this leap is. That would be like hearing someone really likes playing Call of Duty and immediately going, yes, you're a fucking war criminal. But in 1979, D&D was new. It was weird. It had dragons and spells and dice and books that looked suspiciously like textbooks for the devil. So instead of people asking, is this likely? They asked, is this scary? And the answer to that was a big, juicy yes. Now we layer in the next ingredient, steam tunnels. Stay with me. Michigan State University had underground utility tunnels, pipes, heat lines, maintenance shit. Totally normal for a big campus. But the moment the word tunnel hits the press, dude, those are no longer utility tunnels. Those are dungeons. And suddenly the story becomes James didn't just disappear, he went underground. Literally. He might be down there right now, playing a game, living a fantasy, lost to reality. And the media absolutely eats this up. Because missing teen struggles with depression is a total bummer. But fantasy game lures teen into underground maze? Now that's a headline. That's a whole TV segment. That's a talking head shaking their fist like parents need to be aware. And this is the moment the story stops being about James. It becomes about the idea of James. The nerd, the gamer, the kid who played pretend a little too hard. And nobody stops to ask the most basic question. Why would a kid who's hurting need a fake reason to leave. But here's the wild part. And I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, but I need you to stay with me. There is zero evidence at this point that Dungeons and Dragons has anything to do with James disappearing. None. There were no notes, no witnesses, no proof he was role-playing in those steam tunnels, no secret Hellfire Club. Just vibes. Really bad vibes. Really bad adult fear vibes. And the media treats those vibes like they're facts. And once that happens, it doesn't fucking matter what the truth is anymore. Because the story people want is already written. And trust me, they are not about to let reality ruin this. So now the story is out there. Dungeons and Dragons, steam tunnels, a missing kid. And once that combination hits the media bloodstream, it's over. You are not getting that toothpaste back in the tube. But here's where things get really important, because this is the part that almost never gets told correctly. Let's talk about those tunnels for just a second. Because they were real. They absolutely existed. They were not made up. But they were also just fucking tunnels. Like pipes, heat lines, maintenance access. Not torchlit corridors full of chanting nerds and spell books. There were no skeletons, no pentagrams, no dungeon master hiding behind a boiler like roll for initiative. Just concrete, steam, industrial infrastructure. And here's the kicker. James had gone into the tunnels before. Not to LARP, not to roleplay, not to live out a fantasy. He went there because he was suicidal and in crisis. This is the part the media absolutely did not want to deal with. James was not acting out a game. He was trying to harm himself. That's it. That's the cold, honest truth. No dungeon master, no live-action campaign, no satanic bullshit. Just a kid in crisis went somewhere isolated because he was hurting. And at one point, he was found alive. He was hospitalized. He received medical treatment. Real doctors. Real explanations. The kind that should have immediately snapped everyone back to reality. And for a very, very brief moment, it kind of looked like maybe the story was going to correct itself. Like maybe the adults in the room were going to say, okay, sorry, we got this wrong. But that moment never really came. Because James being alive did not undo the damage. The D&D angle was already out there. The steam tunnel myth was already circulating. The media had already decided what the story was. And we overreacted and blamed a board game instead of addressing mental health is not a headline anyone wanted to run. So even after James was found, the myth stayed. Which is wild because even William Deere, the investigator whose early speculation helped spark all of this, later went on record saying that the D&D angle had been blown completely out of proportion. He admitted the media latched onto it. He admitted it was not evidence. It was just conjecture. But by that point, it didn't matter because the headline had already escaped. And headlines, once they escape, they never come back. So now we're in this situation where James's real struggle, depression, isolation, pressure is basically footnoted, while the fake story becomes the story. James went on living for about a year after that. And this is another part that tends to get glossed over in the retellings. Finding someone alive does not magically fix everything, especially when the underlying issues are still there. James continued to struggle with severe depression, with isolation, with the weight of expectations that never really let up. And in 1980, at the age of 17, James Dallas Egbert III died by suicide. And that should have been the moment. That should have been the point where the narrative finally snapped back to the truth. Because now there was no mystery left to solve. No disappearance, no tunnels, no fantasy explanations needed. Just a very clear, very tragic reality. A gifted kid fell through the cracks. But instead of recalibrating, the culture just doubled down. James's death didn't end the D&D panic. It cemented it. Because now the story could be told backwards. See? This is what happens. This is why you should be worried. Never mind that the game had absolutely nothing to do with it. Never mind that James's struggles predated all of this. Because the myth was more useful than the truth. And then pop culture poured concrete over it. Suddenly, you've got talk shows, concerned parents, church groups, experts who definitely did not know how Dungeons and Dragons worked, trying to explain it confidently on television. And in 1982, you get Mazes and Monsters, a made-for-TV movie starring a very young Tom Hanks, which basically takes the distorted version of James's story and turns it into a moral lesson. Play fantasy games, lose touch with reality. Bad things happen to you. And once that message hits television, it's game over, man. Because now it's not just news, it's entertainment. It's something parents watch and go, yeah, that totally tracks. And from that point on, James stops being remembered as a person. He becomes a reference, a talking point, a warning, a name people invoke without actually knowing what happened to him. He gets cited in sermons, in news segments, in anti-Dungeons and Dragons pamphlets, in the early waves of the Satanic Panic. And the cruel irony is this: James was not destroyed by imagination. He was erased by it. His real story, the quiet one, the uncomfortable one, got buried under a much louder lie. And that lie turned into a template. Because once you decide a hobby is the problem, you don't have to fix anything else. You don't have to talk about mental health. You don't have to examine academic pressure. You don't have to admit adults missed the signs. You just ban the thing. And we've been doing that ever since. And listen, you might be thinking, all right, that was awful, Nate, but also, that was a long time ago. The late 70s, it was a different world, different panic. And yes, on the surface, sure. But here's the thing that keeps sticking with me. This didn't stop in the 80s. We just kept swapping out the hobby. Comic books were corrupting kids. Heavy metal music was corrupting kids. Dungeons and Dragons was corrupting kids. Video games were corrupting kids. Rap music was corrupting kids. The internet was corrupting kids. Social media is corrupting kids. TikTok is corrupting kids. It's the same sentence, just with a different noun. And every time something awful happens, we still reach for the same shortcut. We never ask, how did this person fall through the cracks? We instead ask, what were they into? And I think that's why James's story still matters. Because once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. You start noticing how fast adults get uncomfortable when kids have inner lives they don't understand. How quickly curiosity gets treated like danger. How often imagination gets framed as a problem instead of a pressure valve. And look, I'm not saying culture has zero influence on people, because of course it does. But culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. People don't get hurt because they read a book, or they roll some dice, or they play a video game. They get hurt when they're isolated, when they're overwhelmed, when they don't feel safe asking anyone for help. And blaming hobbies lets us avoid dealing with that, because it's way easier to ban something than to build support systems. It's way easier to point at a thing than to admit we missed all the signs. And that's the through line here. That's why this is not just a Dungeons and Dragons story. It's a media story. It's a mental health story. It's how adults react to fear story. And honestly, it's kind of a warning. Not about games, but about what happens when panic moves faster than empathy. That's why I wanted to start the Nerd Crime Files with this case, because this is the blueprint. This is the moment where nerd culture became a convenient villain, and where we learn just how easy it is to turn a real person into a symbol if it helps us feel safer. And I don't want to keep telling these stories the way they've always been told. I don't want the scary version, I don't want the simplified version, and I definitely don't want the version that forgets the person at the center of it. I want the full story, the uncomfortable one, the human one. Because once you understand that version, the panic stops being mysterious. And maybe the next time something bad happens, we press pause before asking all the wrong questions. This story does not end with a monster. It ends with a lesson we keep refusing to learn. James wasn't a warning about imagination. He was a warning about what happens when fear gets louder than empathy. And the fact that his name is still brought up more often as a myth than as a person, that's the part that still kind of hurts. Because once you actually understand what happened to him, once you strip away the tunnels, the dice, the panic, there's nothing left to be afraid of. Just a kid who desperately needed help and a culture that did not know how to listen yet. That's where we're going to leave this one. Not because the story is easy and not because it wraps up neatly, but because James Dallas Egbert III deserves to be remembered as more than a rumor, more than a headline, more than a warning label someone else slapped on him. He was a real kid with a real life and a real future who needed understanding, not hysteria, because imagination didn't kill James. Fear did, and silence did. This is just the beginning of Nerd Crime Files. There are going to be more stories just like this. Moments where fandom, media, and moral panic collided with very real consequences. Stories you've probably heard about, but not like this. Same empathy, same skepticism, same refusal to settle for the easy explanation. If this episode meant something to you, if it made you think, or even just made you feel a little less alone in the things you love, here's how you can help keep this going. Follow the show. Leave a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you know someone who grew up being told the things that they love were dangerous or wrong, share this episode with them. That stuff genuinely matters more than you think. As always, shout out to my player 2, my co-op partner for life, for letting me disappear down research rabbit holes and come back with, okay, but hear me out. Shout out to Cap for believing in the dream. And shout out to my brother Ian, holding down the fort, keeping me grounded when my brain starts sprinting ahead of my mouth. And shout out to Pickle, who exists solely to keep us humble and always on our toes. And most importantly, shout out to all of you for listening, for trusting me with stories like this, and for sticking around when the answers are not easy. Stay gold, nerd bold, and always remember, before we blame the things kids love, maybe we should probably ask how they're doing. I'll catch you on the next one.
Game over.